All right, hello, ladies, gentlemen, and everyone else. Today is a very, very, very exciting day for me because I am here with fantastic writer, personal inspiration to me, and creator of a couple books that I enjoy, Kieron Gillen. How are you doing today, man? Thank you so much for coming on.
I'm delighted. I'm always like, anytime I see a pile of my books, I'm aware that, oh no, I've written enough to hurt people's backs now. So like, it's
The stack almost
it's
fell off
very
my
real.
desk before recording, and I barely saved it. That would have caused a problem, but it turned out very, very okay. Now, this is actually the second time that we've talked. We met very briefly at Emerald City Comic Con, of course, for a quick interview then. And then that coincided with the first announcement for your new series, The Power Fantasy. And now, several months later, it's release day for issue 1. I'm sure it's been a long road to get there. How are you feeling about that? Are you excited?
Obviously, it's like you spend so much time like working on something in the vault. I mean, that kind of like the running joke in Zoolander is this kind of I've got to tame the beast before releasing it, and there's a lot of like that in terms of like we've been hyping it up, we've been really like saying it's good, and so now finally we give it to people, say, hey, this is our new thing, what do you think? So it's that kind of it's a moment when the rocket takes off, or like people just get to be there, which is nice.
Yeah.
So, it's very hard to talk about. You just don't know because you think it's good, and then basically people will tell us.
Yeah. Well, given your past work, I have a lot of faith in it, and we're going to talk more about that as we get to the end of this little interview, of course. But I have a whole list of questions for you here. Some of them more serious about creative process and stuff, a bunch of silly ones as well. But we're going to start off with a very basic question, one I'm sure you've been asked a million times before, but it's also a good start that I think people always want to know. So, how did you first get into comics? You've been in the game for a while. How did that start?
Get into comics as in reader or creator.
Let's say either. Reader was what I had in mind, but I mean, either
Yeah.
one
I
works.
mean, like I'm British, so like I grew up in a small town in Britain, and there was no comic shop there. So the comics I read as a kid, was whatever they had reprints in the like British comics in the newsagent, reprints of American comics, occasional one-off issues of an American comic we got. And I sort of drifted out in my teenage years because there wasn't just any access to books I would be reading them, but I was always comics curious. So like I went to live in America for a year, and I basically had to wait 3 hours for my visa in London, and I just wandered into like Virgin Megastore in Oxford Street, and I saw a copy of Watchmen, and I knew I knew I should have known about Watchmen because it's been in because I was a music person as well, so it's in the music press. So I
Yeah.
picked up Watchmen, read it to cover the cover whilst waiting for the this American visa, and that was this sort of unlocking and changing my life really. It took me 5 years to sort of really get into comics properly. But
Yeah.
that kind of Watchmen was the way in that kind of operate. And as a creator, like I got into comics hard in 2000. And one of my coming from a fanzine background, my thing is always just when you love something, you kind of want to do it. It doesn't matter if you do it good or bad. Like I was in terrible when I was in a music fanzine, I was in terrible bands. And it wasn't about being good. It was about expressing your love by doing it. So almost as soon as I got into comics properly, I was doing my own. Like so, these little like zines. I talked artists into doing stuff. I did like photo comics. I did like collage, and all that stuff. And I was on the scene enough, like in the British small press and like online, that eventually it got to a point where I got, hey Kieran, do you want to pitch at this company? You know what I mean? So it was like the work led to other work, and Image asked me. Pause for a second. To be specific, I was going to pitch this book at another company, and I showed the pitch of Phonogram, my first like creator own book, McKelvey. I showed that to Lauren McCubbin, who was art director at Image at the time, and Lauren said, "Hey, why are you not pitching this at us?" And we did, and they said
Wow.
yes. Yeah, honestly, it's like everything about Phonogram was hard except for that bit.
What would I think notoriously be the most difficult? That must have been incredible to hear, though. Like that's a
Oh
best
no,
case
like
scenario.
it's like tell you, like as a weird anglophone, like there's an anglophone strand of American comic editors, so like that's a weird secret advantage. I remember like Phil Bond's Phil Bond, Shelley Bond's husband saying, are you sure this was an attempt to just basically get work at Vertigo? As in, okay, we'll do a comic that Shelley likes, and then Shelley will hire us and we'll get money.
Uh,
Yeah, but alas, we're not that clever.
I mean, if it worked out, it worked out, and you're here today, so clearly it did. Now, I have, like I said, a whole list of questions. You saw the stack of books that I have. I have questions that I could ask about all of these, but there's one on the top that I have been wondering about for a while, and so we're going to immediately jump into a more complicated question, maybe, about specifically Judgment Day. Or
Yes.
maybe I should say AVXVE Judgment Day for anyone watching who doesn't know. The full title is Avengers vs. X-Men vs. Eternals. Now, I love this event. It's, I think, one of the most interesting in recent years. But I have to be honest, when it was being marketed and, released and teased and all that, I wasn't like immediately leaping to get it in single issues. But like, I saw your name on it and I kind of figured I would read it at some point. But I wasn't leaping to it immediately because it was pitched sort of as that Versus kind of event. And then I remember hearing when my friends started reading it in single issues, the immediate response across the board was, it's not really a Versus event. It is using a Versus event as a vehicle to tell this way more philosophical and interesting story. And I'm so curious, what was the process of coming to that sort of creative idea, and then also maybe pitching that to Marvel? How did you get this really unique story done?
It's like a weird one, isn't it? Like, I basically, Tom Brevoort just dropped me a line saying, "Hey, do you want to do Avengers versus X-Men versus Eternal event?" Like, not, and so the kind of the course, it's the Eternals, it's the good period, something that sort of brings the lines together. And of course, how to phrase this? Since Avengers vs. X-Men was such a big sales success, that kind of like structure is something that they're familiar with as a kind of like something that's to hang a story off.
Yeah,
and for me, it's like I just went away and then thought, okay, what can I do? Because I was already sort of thinking about some X-Men Eternal stuff already for Immortal, because Immortal X-Men was just starting at that point. And it was like, okay, what I was going to do is a quite quiet, weird story about this invisible war between X-Men and Eternals became a much more overt war. And that was for me, that was the important thing. I said, okay, let's do something which comes from the story. So if it's a conflict between them, not just like the Eternals all deciding to punch the X-Men, like we've got it's basically the bad Eternals versus the X-Men, and then everyone else gets dragged in. So that's part of it. The other part was like, a basic belief of an event book should be able to be enjoyed by itself. So whilst it also emerges from the story, it's also got to be about something.
Yeah.
And here's a really simple idea.
That's really simple idea is such a good way to describe the idea of Tony Stark creating a Celestial. I love that. But it is a good elevator pitch. You're right.
It's like basically, it's like a god comes along and judges at the entire Marvel universe. Do you pass or fail? And it's like, and plus I was a father of a young child, had there's a lot about thinking about the future there. It's kind of a story about climate change, because climate change will be judged in aggregate, because it's not like, because the whole thing about the Celestial, this idea is more people on Earth pass than fail, we all live. If more people fail than pass, we die. In other words, it doesn't, your individual merit matters, but it also, everyone else's merit matters.
Looking at the collective on that very individual scale. That's one of the reasons I think it's so interesting.
Yeah, exactly. So like those big questions, and of course, on a kind of like gut level, I think it's really the sort of thing will get people chatting, as in who's going to pass and fail. They're going to fight, or the fans will be arguing about it, and that's fun, because it's like, it's not objective. The Celestial, shall we say, warped. The Celestial is kind of like a Marvel Universe fan, and we've all got our own kind of like, okay, who do we think passes and fails? So it's kind of like, imagine if a random fanboy or fangirl was put in charge of the Marvel Universe with cosmic power. There's kind of an element of that, but yeah. So nothing big about personal, because I forget whose line it was, but like there's an argument that superhero comics are the literature of ethics, that kind of thing, and that there's part of me.
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember the name either.
Yeah, I can't and that's quite core to me, and I'm quite a cynical human being in lots of ways. And I tend towards bittersweet, but the fundamental thing of what is good is like right at the heart of like the genre. So this is kind of put that right there. So that was the idea, like doing something that was embedded in the Marvel universe, but also asked a simple question. And of course, the book turns it on you as the reader. I've seen a lot of people talk about like, would I pass or fail? And that's absolutely what I hope for. That's when I did the human viewpoint characters you had as well. I kind of wanted to make clear it's not just heroes, it's about everybody. Every single person is a possible hero. That's kind of everyone in the Marvel universe is trying to save it today or not. So yeah, that's where it sort of came from. Also, like literally, it was like my first year as a father, and I wrote a lot of comics in it. It was like my cheerful breakdown. I barely remember writing most of it. It's like I wrote 18 issues of the whole crossover was mine. That's a lot of issues.
Yeah, that was a big one for you. I remember going through and looking at the the author credits. But that's so. I love that it started out as that Versus pitch, and then you were able to iterate on it so much. I think I'm actually gonna adapt my order that I was going to ask these questions in, because I have one that was going to be towards the end because it's a larger sort of scale one, but the answer to that will transition into it very nicely, so we're going to move it up. This is, again, more of a philosophical one, so if you don't have an answer immediately, maybe you do. I don't know. But we'll edit it to make you look good either way.
I look much cleverer.
So writers, of course, have their signature things in every medium, be it like a theme or a tool or a narrative tone or something like that. There's certain things that every writer excels at. As someone who's read a lot of your work, one of the signature things that I've noticed and really respected about yours is you're really good at writing the general theme of stories where in some way or another man creates God. What do you think drew you to that type of storytelling?
Like, I'm a recovering Catholic. I was raised in the Catholic tradition, so there's so much Catholic stuff in my books. And that's why, just because it's the framework I've seen the universe, and in some ways, the question, the great judgment. That's one of the most Catholic themes. And do you pass or fail? I mean, literally, the panel with Daredevil being one of the biggest Marvel characters I've written the least. The panel where I failed Daredevil, and Daredevil pretty much goes, "I know," that's the
classic Daredevil.
Yeah, but as somebody, of course, leans atheist, and not in that way, but in a much more whatever we have created we've created. So we have made God in that way. There's a line by Alan Moore that talks about it doesn't matter if God exists. The one place we know God exists is up here, and then all the demons and angels exist in all their majesty in our heads, and that's about he's obviously a magician, and that to be honest I agree with. This interesting thing is somebody who's a hard materialist understands the power of faith. So I'm not I'm somebody who absolutely gets that part, but in some ways, a created God isn't necessarily any worse than a God that created us in that way.
Yeah.
That's kind of the weird, because it's what is ethics or standards, but creating a God you're trying to live up to. And you judging yourself is as hard as anything else. But partially all that's there. I think the theme behind the theme is people talk about this quite regularly with mine. Is about stories or and the kind of theme I come back to is, are we trapped in the stories that we tell ourselves? I'm not the sort of writer who goes, stories are wonderful and magical, or that I do go, they're magical, but I go, and that makes them petrifying.
Yes. Yes.
That's it.
The Wicked and the Divine being one of my favorite comics. That's a huge theme, and that the last issue of that comic, I haven't reread that series in a while. I need to go back after this interview, but after years, the last issue of that comic is burned into my brain forever with the way it ties everything in.
Thank you. But no, that's absolutely Wicked was probably the ultimate statement to that kind of belief. As in, it's always my stuff after that has perhaps done it less, but because Wicked did it as hard as I could. Mm-hmm. But they'd be aware of the dangers of the traps in our head. That's kind of where the gods come. That's the sort of element. You see it in Eternals. Yeah, Eternals really is a good example of that, because Eternals are literally created by a god, and they're all barely people. That's the horror, as in they are trapped in a very, very rigid role, and that's the horror of them. The idea of being like that, and that's often described horror as the way I think about horror is something that maybe isn't true, but you're afraid could be, and it's playing. You know what I mean?
That's another good line.
You know what I mean?
I shouldn't be surprised that you're giving good lines in an interview. You're a writer, but I mean they're happening anyway.
I'm also a recovering critic, so it's I kind of turn my lens on myself quite a bit. So I kind of look at my stuff and go, okay, what the hell was that about? So yeah, there is that part, but it's also, as you said, it's about the idea of creating God, but it's also the idea of the horrors of being trapped. You see that with Loki, you see that with Divine, you see that with Eternals, you see it all the way through as in, and what that's really about, and that goes back to Catholicism is you're born fallen and you try to transcend. That's a very common arc. If you look at my big stories, they often start as someone being terrible for a long time, but trending towards transcendence. My idea is it's quite often difficult to be good, and that's kind of and how can we get there? It's actually flip it around. Actually, I don't really believe that. What I believe is actually very easy to be good, and I'm more interested to how do people talk themselves into being bad. That's what the lies we tell ourselves to allow us to be cruel.
Third
and
incredibly good philosophical line in one answer.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, seriously, when you start asking about themes, you get that, because it's there's a reason why we read stories, and it's not just stories aren't just morals or ethics or that, but stories, of course, are complicated. And why they're one of the reasons why I love stories is because they contain many things. Like Wicked and Divine, as you said, it's there's 13 characters all failing in different ways, and there's a conversation about it. And you do it in a story because, whilst there's a truth behind it you're trying to talk about, it's also about the complexities of that truth, because it's never that easy. Or like look at Eternals and how all those different characters respond to the fact that the awful trappedness, and some of them just don't care,
Yeah.
and it's how do they delude themselves that they don't care, and so on and so forth.
I love sort of not like openly fourth wall breaking meta narratives like that, but those sort of pseudo meta narratives almost. I remember one of my favorite quotes from that. I don't know who originally said it. I heard it from Donny Cates, but I believe he was quoting somebody else. Or actually, maybe it was in Crossover. It might have been in his book Crossover, but the idea, who is more real, you or Superman? Because Superman is a story, but that's going to have arguably a larger effect on the world than any individual person is. And that idea of the stories being the things we tell ourselves, but also something that we can trap ourselves with is really fascinating.
Yeah. It's interesting. Like, it's actually, I mean, Grant Morrison did that position a lot, obviously, with his All-Star Superman. That's the thing. And like I said about my fundamental pessimism, and obviously I love Grant. I love Donny as writers. But I mean, Grant looks at the amazing perfection of Superman, as in Superman is this very pure idea. Don't deconstruct Superman. The point of Superman is somebody who will save you and all this, and the wonder of that. And it is a wonderful idea. But I just can't help but go, and Lex Luthor's always going to be an arsehole. But my brain goes like the people are trapped in a good story. Well, don't say they don't interest me, but I don't worry about them.
Yeah.
People are trapped in a bad story. I kind of like, and I think that comes back to Catholicism again. I think like most sort of sensitive Catholic kids, you look at Judas and go, poor guy. He was fated. He had to do this, but now he's Judas, and he's always going to be Judas, and nothing will ever change that. There's a really good graphic novel that came out from Boom about Judas in hell.
I haven't heard of that. What's that called? I'll write it down.
It's actually just called Judas. It's from Boom. I forget the artist and writer, but it's really good. I really like. It's kind of like it finds a really kind of poetic way to swear it, and there's a comfort there, I think, in it. Anyway, but that's it's called Eternals, so that's one of the things that attracted me about Eternals. Eternal doesn't mean living forever; it means unchanging, and there's something fear in there because I mean, it speaks to my kind of. Anytime I think about my weaknesses, it's like I don't want to be like that. Like when I'm sort of, I don't know, say something mean to like somebody. You know what I mean? Like why did I say that? That was a failing of character, and so on and so forth. So there's a line we dropped into Peter Cannon. Better is a direction. As in better isn't static. Better is that's what people often like. Especially I'm old enough to sort of think about this. Like progressive people, progression implies change. And so whatever. It's a moving position. And you've got to be open to that, and so on and so forth.
That is fascinating. I love all of those meta narrative discussions. Let's see what else I've got to scroll back up because, like I said, that was at the end because I knew it would be a longer discussion. But I'm so glad we got to it right at the beginning. Let's see. Let's go to a slightly more lighthearted one now. When we talked in March, I mentioned Sins of Sinister, which is another one of my favorites that you've done. I love Mr. Sinister as a character overall because he is unapologetically a bitch all the time, and it's fun to read. I imagine it's also fun to write. But then in Sins of Sinister, and then in the ensuing Fall of X stuff with Enigma and all that, we have the 4 paths to Dominionhood, which is, if I remember them correctly off the top of my head, mutant powers, human factors, cosmic forces, and then magic. If you, as a person, could choose one of those paths to Dominionhood, which one would you choose to try and take?
Oh man, I don't think I'd immediately reject the question because the idea of a Dominion of me is like, no.
Fair enough. Hey, we didn't say you might be successful. Maybe there's already one up there who will absorb it.
Yeah. But if I was forced to do it, I would have to inevitably. I'm a writer. I would just choose magic. It's the spelling. It's one of those kind of animal positions. Like it's called spelling for a reason.
Yeah. There's a line, the Mother Righteous, what's the exact line when she's talking to sisters, you use 4 letters, I have 26.
Yes, exactly that. So the kind of magic is writing is magic. Yep. Those two, the bard and the magician were once the same sort of career. That's probably the only one I'm qualified to try. I mean, I did my degree is in the sciences. So maybe if it's an alternate time path, we could go and do either the human factor or the other one, or the mutant factor. I couldn't do the cosmic factor. I think that's our human can only do that.
Yeah, that one's probably a little bit harder to accomplish. Now, I do have to admit, I asked that question with an ulterior motive in mind that I have to give some context for because I have a little bit of a challenge for you here. See, a few weeks ago, I was making some videos about Secret Wars 2015 and just talking about that arc and the Beyonders. And in one of them, I very casually mentioned that sort of retroactively, one of the root causes of that was the threat of Enigma. That's why the Beyonders acted in the first place. And I mentioned super quickly, and then a ton of people were like, hang on, who is Enigma? And enough people asked that led me doing a dedicated video in which I tried to sum up the entirety of Enigma, like start to finish, for people who might not have the context. But because of TikTok, I was capped at 10 minutes. And it was very difficult, but I did it. And because I want a little bit of revenge, but hopefully this will be fun, I asked that question to sort of prime your brain. Because my challenge to you is, I have a stopwatch here. Try to explain as much lore of Enigma to someone with no context, but I'm going to time you for 60 seconds.
Okay, let me just pause.
You want to play?
Let me just take for a couple of breaths.
Yeah, take the time you need. We can edit it.
Yeah, I speak quickly and stumble. That's my weakness. However, where would I start with Enigma? Minions, I guess.
And for the record, I love Enigma. Very interesting character, very cool world building. Difficult to take all of those comics and compress them. Not what it's meant for, of course, but a fun exercise, I think.
I'm going to give the listeners a little note before I go in. I think that the secret to explaining Enigma is actually explain as little of Enigma as possible, because in reality it's about explaining Dominions. So
True. That is what most of my explanation ended up being.
Okay, let me try.
All right, I'll give you a count here. 3, 2, 1, go. So 3, 2, 1, go.
We talk about the singularity, the idea of us all becoming machine brains. The minions are about the path to the machine brains. But you get to a point where the number of human intelligences merge to form another intelligence, and another intelligence, and another intelligence. You get to a point where there's an entire planet made of human brains. And beyond that is what we call a dominion. A dominion basically lives outside time and space. It goes into another dimension and sort of moves between the moments freely. It's entirely safe. It is made out of untold trillion consciousnesses. They occasionally bring new people into them. They float around. However, one day, someone became aware of their existence of this, and eventually one day they would be consumed. This egotistical monster planned a route to make himself become a dominion. His intelligence copied infinite times. He created 4 versions of himself to try to do it, then harvested them. And eventually, in that moment, became Enigma, the fake Dominion.
53 seconds. Excellent job.
Yeah.
Excellent job.
The trick is like you drop the phrase like outside time and space as if that means anything.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's it. It's kind of like, the thing about Enigma, he's a fake Dominion, because the idea of Dominions are all different intelligences, and Enigma is sinister copied infinite times. Not infinite, a lot, trillions of times. So yeah, that's the weirdness of it, I guess. Of course, that's definitely the thing what Alan was writing about in terms of foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Is that, Beyonders are just weak against things that exist outside time and space. There's a lot of things like fans of comic books will say who is more powerful, but it's not really like that. It's like, because one of the things like who is weak and strong against who is like, the kind of the rock paper scissors. It's like what's more powerful, rock paper scissors, and it's like no, they're all just weak against they can defeat each other.
I cursed myself like a month and a half ago at this point, maybe a little longer, because I decided to do a breakdown video on a character you probably know because you operate in the X-Men sphere, Iska the Unbeaten. Very interesting character, power-wise. It's handled in a really, really cool way. I like Iska a lot conceptually. And now, always and forever, the Monkey's Paw Curled, that video got like 1 million views. And then every video I post talking about a character, comments are always, what happened if they fought Iska? Every single time. I'm like, oh, I never should have done this.
I mean, it's like the thing about someone like Iska. She's a poet. She's a philosophical question. It's the classic. Could God make a lift? Could God make a rock so heavy he couldn't lift it? And she lives exactly in that mode of poetry, and that's also Al's very good at the poetry of superheroes. And who would win? Whatever's most interesting and poetic is always the answer.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's like the last line I said in that video. I was like, well, it's gonna depend on whichever's really cool or whichever's more interesting, whichever tells the best story, because that's ultimately what matters.
I mean, I get why comic fans get hung up on it, because I completely get it.
Yeah, it's fun if you don't take it too seriously.
Yeah, but it's like people also, how did this character lose against this character? And it's like, even in the real world, boxers, the championship boxers will defeat everyone, and then someone gets a lucky punch and then they lose. Even in the real world, the best boxer doesn't always win, and doesn't win all the time. That's why we watch boxing. I don't, but why people generally watch boxing. So in comics, I mean, it's going to be even more so. The idea that occasionally the Thing will punch out the Hulk or whatever.
I mean, to paraphrase, but there's the very classic Stan Lee quote where he says something to the effect of just, the writer, whoever wins a fight is just the one that the writer wanted to win.
Yeah, and that's, I talk about this in I did a book called Uber, and Uber was deliberately me trying to do a materialist superhero story. So it's like, it was based on rules. Oh no, if this sort of hero fights this sort of hero, then we'll always win. Like, if the same, like, the equivalent of like the rock paper scissors, and that's the opposite of like the Marvel universe. If the Marvel universe, Spider-Man fought Galactus, Spider-Man would find a way to defeat Galactus if it had to in the story. Because that's the romantic tradition it's working in. But like in the Uber sort of materialist tradition, no, every single time Galactus will stomp on Spider-Man because it's not that sort of story, and that says a lot. It's one of the things like who wins between, I don't know, Superman or Thor. THOR, and it's like it depends what universe it's taking in and the story. I mean, that's what Earth 2 did with Morrison and Quietly. The whole idea of here evil wins. You know what I mean? That there's fictional rules in the reality. In the same way, the authority. I mean, Batman has protection because he's Batman because he works in this universe. Like in the Uber universe, he'll be killed from orbit the first time he fought Superman. Like. It's just not that means anything. That doesn't make it a bad story or anything.
No, it's an interesting way to look at it that you don't see very often.
Yeah.
And once again, actually going out of that, I'm going to change up the order of my interview a little bit because this leads into another question that I had about the power fantasy. I was looking through some other interviews that you did talking about it just to get some question ideas, and I really liked a point that you made where you said, and I'll let you elaborate on this as you choose, but you said essentially the idea or a core idea of this comic is if these superpowers come into conflict, lose. Everybody loses. This is like ultimate crisis that people are not coming back from. And I think that's an interesting play on the sort of power scaling thing. A fight can't happen because if a fight happens, it is ultra level catastrophe. How did you decide to write a story with that tone? Because that's not something, again, that you see very often in superhero comics or superpower comics.
Yeah, that's what haven't we done is always part of the appeal. Like, I think the actual moment of inspiration was me. I was writing Immortal X-Men, and of course, there's been a power creep in superhero comics across the 50 years. Like if you go back, I read all the early Claremont stories when it was part of the Immortal. And like early on, like everyone is passing out when they walk upstairs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like they're infinitely weaker. And of course now, like they can terraform Mars. And that's about generations of power creep based upon writers basically giving readers what they like. So there's and I was writing. I think it was Exodus versus Storm. It was at least around that point, and it was like the only way. If I was writing in a realist mode as opposed to the romantic mode, there's no way these two could fight. Because that's it would be like who doesn't back down more, and the power would get higher and higher, and eventually the world would explode. Because they are that powerful now. And so I did thought these people just couldn't fight. They're like nuclear bombs, and no one wins a nuclear war. That's the point. And I just went, okay, that's a story. And you can't do it in the Marvel universe, which is one reason why I would never do it there. And then it becomes a story about how can we avoid fighting. And then you're doing Cold War stories. And of course, when people who have read Power Fantasy 1, you'll say, oh, there's lots of things they can do to avoid fighting. And it's actually more horrific. Okay, if fighting is the lose condition, what do they do to avoid fighting? And also, what do they do to get what they want? So it's like, because that's the thing, is that pretty much the opening scene, the character Etienne Lux, who is the ultra-powerful telepath character, he's trying to talk Valentina, who's kind of I'm using these kind of like things broadly. She's kind of the Superman. She's like the kind of like
that archetype, yeah.
Yeah, she's a heroic and nice and from outside, and she's trying to talk her into we should take over the world. We need to do.
That's the opening scene. That's a hell of a hook.
Yeah, exactly. His first line is, of course, the ethical thing to do would be to take over the world, and we kind of go,
yes,
and he's
hell of a hook.
You know what I mean? That's the appeal, and she probably says, as you might imagine, says no, because otherwise the book's very different to begin with. But like his thing is like, we're basically okay. I'm not perfect. He knows that. You're really nice. Imagine if the next one turns up and it's Dharma. A serial killer gets these powers equal to ours. Like that's the end of the world. We need to work out a way to stop other people, essentially nuclear proliferation. We need a way to really stop this happening and getting out of control. And then it sets up the whole story being about the kind of like the Cold War, as in, because it's the story set across 50 years. So as different superpowers emerge, the power balance changes, and like the world history changes. So like it's we're set in 1999 to the beginning of the story, and at a glance it's very similar, but you'll start noticing things which are a bit different. So like, and as we go through the story, you see, what happened? What happened in 1981? What happened in 1971? The first scene is 1966. So like it's that kind of
1966.
with a very fully developed timeline. I mean, like as the different characters are merged, how the world changes. At the same time, how it doesn't change. You know what I mean? Like we've got lists of presidents. Like
Interesting.
there's a few elections that went different ways. You know, there's that kind of it's really big alternate history. While still being quite accessible, and it's all about what do these 6 people with incredible power change the world by not fighting. You know what I mean?
It
I mean,
sounds fascinating.
no, sorry, there's a line one of the characters. I don't think they've said it yet. Actually, it's kind of like because there's no actual quote unquote superheroes in the book. No one does superhero stuff because for various reasons, because it just wouldn't happen in this story. How do you save the world? I save the world every day. I don't use my powers, and that's the weird.
That's definitely getting clipped because that line alone is going to make people immediately go and pick up the book.
Because a character like Masumi, she's kind of she can't use her power in any way that's useful. It's like if you lose control, she becomes like a kaiju Godzilla thing the size of Japan.
Very all or nothing person or monster. Yeah.
Yeah, so she has to try to keep balance for her art. So it's almost like Bruce Banner was a serious artist. Like it's kind of Bjork meets Bruce Banner would be my kind of a way of looking at it. So like, and that's a very different one because obviously she can't want anything or like, but as you would talk about, imagine if someone else had her powers, like someone who's a bit more like, okay, I need to own a country. Like if you don't, I'll sulk and you'll the world. You know what I mean? Like that kind of if someone else
it can
had
get
powers,
turned into a kill switch so quickly.
exactly, yeah. But other people like that, someone like Heavy, who's a serious political guy who really wants social change. Etienne, who's mainly about let's not kill everybody, and so on and so forth. A guy called Majors, who's a complete sellout. Like he used to be a lot more radical in the punk days, and he's across the 80s. Actually, specifically in 1989, due to an event called the Second Summer of Love, he went, actually no, I want to go hard right and get paid. So it's fun. Anyway, I ramble, but they're like, you know what I mean?
Hey, you're here to promote that book. Don't apologize for rambling. And it was an interesting one, so
it is honestly. It's
that was all great.
If Watchmen had 6 Dr. Manhattans, and if all those Dr. Manhattans were your kind of like complete messy mates, and they had to not have a fight ever again, or everyone dies, that's kind of what drives the book. It's about the people, and it's also about the ideas, and that's if anyone's read my stuff, that's what I think my best stuff is. It's about it's about a real strong philosophical core, but it's also about people.
Yeah, they're going back to that man creates God. It's how humans are going to deal with these massive concepts. Now, this is an ongoing series, right? Just making sure.
It's ongoing.
This is an ongoing, which is exciting. I know a couple of my friends thought it was a mini at first and was very excited to hear that there was going to be more to it. I have a bit more of a technical question related to ongoing, because I'm a writer myself. I want to get into this space at some point. So this is something about just the process. But how far out are ongoings made? Like for indie stuff, or if you're doing something bigger for Marvel, I'm sure they have different standards there. But like, at the time issue 1 of that series is coming out, like Power Fantasy is, like how many issues are done ready to ship? What's the standard for that, roughly?
Yeah, the standard rule for Image is 3 issues are in the can when you come out.
Only 3?
No, even like actually 3 when you solicit is the thing. Like, but in the actual fact, I mean, like Marvel books are quite regularly like don't have that many in the can. Like
really? I would have thought at least like 6 for an arc.
Yeah, can I like no, alas. This is a weird one. They can sort of plan for that. One of the awful weird secrets is almost everyone in the industry has ADHD, as far as I can tell. So if you kind of like that, if you don't give a deadline that means something, a lot of artists don't even do it. And I say that to my artist friends with all the love.
No, yeah, it's true.
Deadline. So they only like you could give them a year and then they only ever do it in the last month. So like I say that broadly, so it's really because people, especially outside the industry, say why don't we just do that? And in reality, it's like we could, but then nothing would ever come out really. But at the same time, you want to be ahead. I mean, how many Power Fantasy? We've got like 3 issues of Power Fantasy in the can now. Like so, yeah, we've got 3 in the can, which I'm comfortable with. We'd always like more, but like we're pretty comfortable. Our next book, we're going to try to get more in the can. That'll be like for next year though.
Next ooh, teasing fancy stuff already.
Yeah, that's the thing about Power Fantasy. It's my only book I'm coming out this year. I've got a graphic novel coming out in November with Stephanie Hans, but like in terms of monthly comic books, it's my only book this year. So it's that kind of like if people want to read me, this is literally the only place to find me. But planning. But the actual other side of planning is just the writing side, because especially looking at Marvel, you're probably writing for multiple artists as well.
Yeah.
So like the structure there is interesting, and the way at least I do it. I describe it as having firm plans and then material, because with Immortal X-Men had a pretty firm plan for the first year. Like I broke it down by issues. That changed because it cut to 10 issues and had to have Judgment Day in the middle. So I had to rewrite that plan.
Obviously that planning
Yeah.
long term is going to shift when there's so many things happening in the same universe.
Yes, and he explained that's actually 100% why planning too firmly at a Marvel book is a waste of time, because it's too much other stuff happening. Like, you want to plan, but you don't have too much of a plan. And then after that, like, first year, I had a kind of, okay, this is what I think the second year is. Like, I describe it as the immoral X-Men. So I didn't know it would be Sins of Sinister to begin with, but I knew that there would be an increasingly immoral Quiet Council. And I knew material I would like to bring, like Enigma mainly. I knew I sort of thought issue 24 is probably when Enigma gets revealed. You know what I mean? So, like, you have all that material. Like, second year will be about the war between the four Sinisters and stuff like that. So you have material, but since it's that far out, you don't want to nail it down because so much stuff changes.
Yeah, of course.
You're talking about creator-owned, however. Like, there's two things. One is, actually, this is Marvel as well. Okay, what happens if it doesn't sell? Like, and I generally, with books, have an off-ramp. In that kind of, like, I don't like leaving things unresolved. So if we have to cut it early, this is what we do. Like, and it's rare that, I mean, to us, actually, neither Wick Div or Die had an off-ramp. But if sales weren't as good as they were, I would have worked out ways to bring things forward. In the case of my actual ongoings, what I generally have is, when I start writing the arc in question, I had that whole arc planned tightly. Yeah?
Yeah.
And then for the later arcs, I know what happens in each arc, roughly, as in this, and also what the big status quo change is, which sets up the next arc. So, like, for Wick Div, it's like, spoiler, okay, because the end of the arc previous, it sets up the status quo for the next arc. So it's this kind of like, we kill Lucifer, and Laura has a flash of power at the end of the first arc. And the second arc is exploring what that means. And at the end of the second arc, we kill Laura. So the third arc is about Laura being absent. End of the third arc is Laura returns. Fourth arc, we kill Anank. You know, that kind of, I describe it as having waypoints on a journey. So I see the waypoints. Like, I know I'm going to march this way next. And when I get to the next waypoint, I can plan in detail, because in reality, a lot of stuff, you've learned a lot of stuff in the process, and you want to put more stuff in.
Especially when it's something that's coming out on a regular basis, because you can get that very interactive feedback, see how people are liking it.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's not even necessarily the feedback. It's more what you learn by walking that journey. Like, you learn so much about characters as you think about them. Like, the more you think about them, the more you realize about them, and they become much more solid, and you get other ideas. So that's why you keep it flexible enough to be able to add stuff, whilst also having a strong direction to give it a story. And the other side, I mentioned material earlier. Like, with, say, Wick Div, I had the character arcs for all the characters at the start, so I knew what most of them were all about. There was a few spaces for, like, wiggle room at the end, but, like, I knew, like, okay, Baal is about this. Baal has done an awful thing because he thinks it's right, and eventually that will be revealed, yada yada. And all those kind of key lines in issue 35 or whatever I drop, I had them at the start, you know. But the question became, okay, when do we choose to reveal those things? Like, so we've got the backbone of the story, but the cast is so complicated. I could bring stuff in, like the whole Morrigan Baphomet story could have came to a climax around issue 24. But I thought, actually, no, we're going to do it later, and that's sequencing. That's what I mean. Like, so you know much more than you ever have. In the case of power fantasy, we've got a very driven story in the present day. Like, lots of stuff goes down. It's like bang, 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 bang. We're building towards stuff. At the same time, we've got 50 years of history. When do we choose to reveal stuff from the past that is important, or do we? So that's kind of a mixture of, like, sequencing and other stuff. Like, but a lot of the issues start with a flashback to, like, a previous period. And it's like, I can basically, okay, now's the time to show Tokyo in 1982. Now's the time to show what happened to the Major.
That must be a fun space to be able to play around in.
Yeah, it's good. It's like having more stuff you ever need means that the book feels realer. You know what I mean? Like, as well as giving you space to play, also, like, I know much more than I will ever tell anybody. And that gives, for me, that gives the work a solidity. Anyway, I'm rambling. Well, it's a lot.
There's an interesting thought process that comes from that, because what it reminds me of, at least with the way that I think about this, is tabletop RPGs. I know you're a tabletop RPG game guy. We were talking about that briefly before we started recording this, but I'm also a big tabletop RPG guy, and I'm a DM. And that's sort of similar to how I think about my world building for settings, is don't plan out as much of, like, what happens with, you know, each individual session. Have a good idea of the world where your players are exploring, and know how that world is going to respond to the things that they do. And it's interesting to hear that the way you think about the comics goes in kind of the same way, but it does make sense.
Yeah, it's about context. I mean, especially jamming is like, if you're running something semi-trad, you'll probably get better mileage of, okay, this town, who's here, what do they want, and then basically what do the players do? Okay, this guy hates people who go into the bar. Oh, he's seen the players go into the bar, he'll do this. You know, that kind of like, when you start thinking about characters and having agency, that's also what writing is. Like, so much about like being an actual writer is looking at trying to make sure all characters are real. Like, trying to make, to not make characters ciphers, give them all individual agency. And like I say this, there's other ways of writing. That's why, for me, I write big group casts, because I'm interested in people interacting and having many multitudes of like attitudes inside. You know, like the most of my stuff is about who's the lead character of the power fantasy. I don't think people will realize. I'm not even sure there is one. You know, like they're all about all these characters being solid. And that one reason I've always been offered jobs like the X-Men and whatever is that I'm pretty good. That's team book writing.
Let's see, what other questions do I have? I've had to bounce so far around. Oh, like we just said, you're a TTRPG guy as well. Another fun question. What system did you start playing TTRPGs on? And if you remember, I'm very curious, what was the first character that you ever played as?
Ooh. Like, okay, I'm speaking my age. I'm 48. I mean, I'm infinitely old. I was kind of like into RPGs just when they were starting to cross over into the mainstream. So in 1985, I was 10. I was a big Tolkien head as well, so my parents bought the Middle-earth role-playing game for obvious reasons. Now, most of the people listening here probably won't know Middle-earth role-playing in that edition. It was based on a system called Rollmaster. Rollmaster is a system which has like a book. Every single weapon has like a 20-column chart, like so, with 100 entries down the side basically, and you roll. Oh, and Rollmaster specifically. Okay, to be fair, Merps only has 5 columns. But they've still all this thing.
Only 5.
It's ludicrously complicated for a 10-year-old. So I kind of opened that and went, like, me and my brother, who's like 2 years younger, we sort of just flipped around the tables, and there was like little paper figures. So we sort of assembled it all, then we moved people around and just like looked up some stuff on the tables. And eventually, like, across the next 5 years, I learned the game. So yeah, I'm not quite a forever GM, but I'm pretty close to a forever GM.
That's the writer's curse, I think, for a lot of cases.
But Merps, so Merps was my first one, and I played that quite regularly. Played some D&D. The first character I remember was a cleric. I think she was called Moonshine. I remember playing it. Like, that's the first one I remember playing. Like, she was D&D cleric, and then of course Harble Furford slightly later when we ran all the way through the enemy within campaign in Warhammer. So that's probably the most I've ever played a single game. Yeah. So Moonshine, let's go with. But there was at least one more which got killed by a kraken. And I must have been 11 for that. My mate Dave Hyland ran it.
Some of the people watching this are going to scream when you say that, because I run a show. I have a little TTRPG show, and the most notoriously popular character was a warlock of a kraken, and some fan of that would just like, oh my god, Glib kill its first character. Someone just freaked out.
Brilliant. Like, we were level 1 characters, like, because we had no idea about power balancing. So it's like literally level 1 characters walk in and saying, "What the, yep," and we're all gonna die. We all died.
Yeah, but hey, if you had fun doing it, which, fingers crossed, getting killed by a kraken can be entertaining at least, I would say, as someone who's done it to my players.
Excellent.
I have some other questions here that are from friends of mine. I sent some of my friends an FYI that I was doing this interview, and I have some questions from them. Let's see, from my friend Dante. I'm going to throw him under the bus here because I let him know that I was doing this interview and I asked if he had any questions for you. And his exact response was silence for several minutes and then, quote, can't think, jealousy coursing through my brain. So he was very excited to hear that this was happening. But
that's what I love.
He asked a very nice question. We'll do 2, actually, from him. First off, he asked what your favorite and or proudest book that you've worked on is, which might be a difficult question, asking you to choose between your works, but it is one that I'd be curious to hear your answer on.
It's tricky, isn't it? Like, I found myself thinking, oh my god, I've had a career now. You know, like, I've been, like, Phonogram came out in 2006, which is like my first real book. I had a couple of things smaller for like Warhammer before then, but in reality, my proper career was nearly 20 years ago. Petrifying. For a long time, I said the Signals Club, the second volume of Phonogram, was the best thing I've ever did. And in some ways, I look at that and think it's a real big, pure, weird burst of stuff. And like, I've definitely done better stuff in different ways since. But in terms of the amount of ambition and ideas into a small set place, That was a real kind of like, oh no, I used to be, what's the word? I could recognize myself as an interesting writer then. Like in that kind of like, that's the sort of stuff if I saw someone else doing, I would admire. So like, and Singles Club felt like that.
Cool way to look at it.
Yeah. Like it's tricky, and it was also like it didn't sell a huge amount. It's when I was kind of it was a proper underground indie sort of stage, and it felt like fighting the system, if you will. So I look at that whole period fondly, even if it was hell. So Singles Club, I think that's really like if you look at that, people haven't read it. 7 stories set in the same nightclub on the same night. It's about Phonogram, which is about music and magic. Specifically, it was kind of like us doing a Wick Div that didn't sell. I saw a joke that Wicked Divine was like Ultimate Phonogram, in that we decided to basically do Phonogram again, but do it in a way which was commercial.
And hey, 9 volumes, it worked, and it's great.
Yeah, no, it's like being like David Bowie and Villain's great. David Bowie doing Let's Dance is great. You know what I mean? These are different, different modes. The work I'm proud of. I mean, normally there's one book I really think is the real work, and that's probably a weird way of putting it. Like stuff like, let's say, choose Once and Future. That's a book I really and Dan Moore kills.
Love Dan Moore's work.
But it's also light for me in that kind of like it's deliberately me having fun. It's actually if you read Once and Future, you kind of get a sense of how I would GM a game. There's a lot of that kind of freewheeling energy.
It has that kind of vibe.
Yeah, but it's not the real work, and the real work is the kind of the stuff because it's that kind of like what is the most personal work I'm doing at any time, and that's either and I'm normally doing one book because you can't do 2 books because it breaks your brain. Like you've got to do lighter, more fun stuff around the side. So it was Phonogram when I was doing Phonogram. It was Wick and Divine when I was doing Wick and Divine. It was Die when I was doing Die, and it's Power Fantasy now. That kind of what's the thing which I think is important, and they're kind of what I think is the important ones. Like if you're going to read nothing else of mine, that's probably the route to go through it. Or like if you want to read the heavy stuff, which you don't necessarily need. One thing I say this, and it sounds like I'm looking down at the other work, and I'm not. I just think it's like what people in the mood for.
It's a different tone. It's more serious. I get asked a lot what some of my favorite comics are. And I always list, and then Wick Div is always at the end of that list. But then, since I don't know who's watching my videos, I always have to end with, don't rate it if you're under 18. If you're under 18, my list stopped before I said that. If you're over 18, please go rate it immediately. But it is definitely that heavier topic.
It's so funny because like Wick Div, of course, is like the lead character's a teenager. It's one of our standard lines is teens aren't rated teen. It's the great irony. And Wick Div's a great book for teenagers, but at the same time, you can't recommend it to it because it's a mature book at the same time.
Yes.
Like I would have read it before I was 18.
I also did, but
you know what I mean? Like,
and I say that, and I realize that my very nice and very supportive mother, who I love very much, is going to watch this interview and be like, "What was he reading when he was a teenager?" It's fine. I turned out fine.
It's not like we're not crossed. I mean, it's not like it's crossed or anything. It's just like it's fine. Like, but it's also a bit like it's a mature book. It just
there's
is.
a lot in it, but it tells the story very well through that. So this is a question that comes from my friend Brandon. I asked him if he had any questions for you, and he responded with, quote, "I really want to come up with a question related to this panel, but I can't think of anything. As you just saw, I have emailed it to you with the subject line, 'I'm so sorry.'"
Yes.
And I will stitch it into the edit of this itself. Now, I don't really expect any sort of deep commentary on this, but in the spirit of answering Brandon's question, any thoughts? Anything you want to share on this panel specifically?
Well, so try to describe this in a kind of a way that won't get you an age gate. Like the panel is.
Don't worry about that. I can bleep out anything. TikTok doesn't care.
2 of our characters who are two of our characters have been overcome with lust to one another and now are having a congress enthusiastically whilst bouncing across the scenery, destroying buildings. And there's alarms sounding, which are basically saying "Congress alarm," except using the word "fucking" instead. And we got that. So basically, we just thought it was an amazing idea to have these 2 people finally having sex and then go everywhere. And then my favorite, like slightly later, there's a bit one of the characters go, "I think it's okay to stop." "Oh no, they're at it again!" And bless them. Otto and what name? I'm sorry, Otto and Gratty's love, or at least lust, is significant. Ludicrous is full of that. It was like Ludicrous is kind of like if June was done as a sex comedy. That's kind of the vibe. It's very fundamentally a silly book, but it's also about the subtext. It was meant to be about the joy of the imagination. It's like the never-ending story of characters who do each other more.
Hearing about the joy of the imagination, which is such a nice, wholesome sounding thing, immediately after the context of that panel, I think it's going to confuse a lot of people in a very good way.
It is. It's that kind of. It's got quite a wholesome heart, does Ludocrats. But at the same time, it's done in very much a mature but not mature way.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff is nice. That's something you see out of it. You don't get to see, like, usually when something is going to go for that very mature vibe, it's gonna sort of try to trend more edgy, and it's nice to have the contrast of that with also being sort of wholesome.
Yeah, it's weird. Like, I know. I mean, like, I say it's wholesome. There's a whole bit where someone ejaculates to freedom, like they're basically a kaiju monster. They stimulate the
wholesome.
Like, but at the same time, it is wholesome. Like in that way, it's kind of what it is. Is the word I wanted to use was bonhomie, that like the French word of like good cheer. It's like because it's the hope was that it was a weird book, but I kind of wanted to make it a friendly book. The idea that no, we're all friends here, we're messing around, it's gonna be a giggle, and I was kind of hoping because people often have it's weird for its own sake response to stuff like that, and I was kind of hoping just by the cheer, no, dude, we're with you, mate, we're all in this together, that people would kind of like not have that response, and no, they had that response. You try.
Oh well.
So, it's got like it's a standalone volume. It's beautifully done. It's just me and several friends messing around. And that's fun, you know, like for 5 issues, especially because Jim wrote all the back matter, and it's got loads of essays about the world in a very silly way. Imagine if like House of X was just wanted to be about really bad sex jokes involving snakes. That's kind of what Ludocrats is.
That's a hell of a pitch. And to Brandon, who did not know that I was asking that question and fully asked it as a joke, there you go. I asked, you're going to find out when you watch this interview, and hey, it actually spawned a pretty nice little conversation about that. So thank you, Brandon, to that.
Thank you, Brandon. I'm about to say, you're learning that you can't ask me anything without getting a real answer. Like, it's my superpowers. Hey, I will take everything seriously.
If every answer has been good and interesting, which it has, absolutely no complaints from me, and I also don't think from anyone else watching. To wrap this up, then, I think, and then obviously we'll talk a little bit more about Power Fantasy at the end. I asked all my ending questions because they slotted in nicely, so I'll go back to another one from Dante, who asked a simple but very good one, which is, what's some quick advice for an aspiring comics writer? We've gone over a few things sort of in the nature of our conversation, but if there's anything else you want to add, please go ahead.
I've got if you Google Kieron Gillen comic writer master post, I've got a master post on my Tumblr, which I linked to a bunch of stuff. So like a load of good resources are there. That's tagged writer advice, I think. So if you click the tag, you'll get some more I put on Tumblr. My newsletter, also I occasionally do writing stuff. Okay, that's stuff to research. In terms of basic stuff, like the most basic stuff is stuff what I said earlier. Like people talk about wanting to break into comics, and in reality, breaking into comics isn't the problem. The problem is staying in comics once you've broken in, and there's nothing more that likely to make you break in and also stay in than basic competence. Like actually, in some ways, and this is the scary part, breaking in too early is the end of your career, because if you break in, get a break, do it badly, now editors think you suck. So
that is scary.
Yeah. Like, so that requires a level of self-knowledge in terms of, am I there yet? And I think I probably waited a bit too long. Like, I was once, you know, but also the flip of it is being in is a great way of getting good because A, you write more, but B, also the panic of, my God, people are reading this.
Yeah, you get an immediate shot of pressure.
Yeah. Oh no, this matters now, which is great because, and working under pressure is kind of part of the job.
Yeah.
In reality, though, in terms of getting good in that way, I put quotation marks around that. It's so important to just do it. Like a lot of writers get hung up on wanting to write the sort of comics they want to write. By which I mean, like, I want to write, I don't know, Spider-Man or Saga, so I'm going to write my huge epic. And then you can't get an artist to do that. And also, you don't know what you're doing. So what you need to do is smaller works. And that's easier to talk artists into doing. And also, artists will not finish most things because that's the nature of the beast, because it's really hard to do work, especially in the small indie field. So what you should probably do is do stuff for yourself in any way you can. By which I mean, like, stick figures. I mentioned collage. I did photo comics. I did. There's others. There's all manner of stuff. I mean, look at XKCD. Look at XKCD. Of course, is literal stick figures, but done beautifully. Because one of the real things about being a comic writer is you're writing for artists. By which I mean, the part of the job is you look at an artist and go, okay, what can they do? What can't they do? How can I write a script that shows them off what they're like, and sort of sidesteps areas where they might be weaker? That's the job. And if you're working for an artist who is really bad, i.e. you have to learn that. So you think, okay, I'm really into drawing fight scenes, but I can't draw fight scenes. Like, well, I like to draw a splash page. My splash page will look terrible. I'll probably get better results by doing lots of small panels, you know, or like alternatively, I'll do a story which isn't okay. I want to do a big fight comic, but I can't do a fight comic for myself. What do I want to do? And I can do, and that's the sort of thing that pushes yourself as a creator.
Yeah, it forces you into that adaptation, so you can get used to that very early. That's cool.
And also, I mean, and also you learn so much more by seeing a finished page, even if it's bad, than a script. Because the second you put a page down, you go, oh no, that was sucked. I need to not do. Alternatively, oh, that bit worked, and you learn your toolbox. Like I mentioned, the photo comic I did, it was called Negative Land, and it was mainly me taking camera out in the early noughties, whenever we were clubbing or like out, and just taking a bunch of shots. And then like every 2 weeks, I looked at the shots and I went, okay, what story can I make out of these images? As in, what technique? So every issue was kind of desperately me working out techniques to use. So I used all manner of stuff to try to tell a story, because there was an overall story, because it was kind of set in what's it set in? It was like a reality TV show with 500 people on, was the plot. And it was basically me talking about living in a small town in England. And they all end up being robots because there's a twist. It wasn't a very good twist. But, you know, the point was doing
I love that toss it. They all end up being robots. Comic books are comic books.
Yeah, exactly. But you got this story going through. But if you actually look at individual episodes, you'll see me going, okay, that works. And it's all just photos, actually inverted, called Negative Land. But like, okay, what can I do to do this story where this character is a serial killer? What can I do to give the vibe here? Or okay, this is a bunch of random club shots. What can I do? And what I end up doing is I have an intro image by one of the characters talking, and then the rest is just annotated shots, and you're telling the story through a series of captions. As in, ooh, wonder who he is. Like, oh no, he's sitting on her. That kind of like, you know, the annotated sort of, you know, yada 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 yada. Point being is, invention forces you to do it. So in other words, doing comics is the best way to learn comics, even if they're bad. In fact, especially because they're bad, because you're doing this stuff on one side, at the same time you're trying to do everything you would do anyway, like finding artists to work with, you know, and building. And at that point you can build a sort of skill set. Don't be afraid of sucking. That's the other one, because you will, and that's fine.
Fantastic advice. All right, and I believe that is all the questions that I have ready. So let's wrap things up by again talking a little bit about the Power Fantasy. We've already gone over a lot of it. We've gone over the concept and a lot of the characters and all that stuff. But of course, since this is promo, we should talk about the fact that it is out today. Issue 1 is ready to go. If you want to give a little bit of a kind of vital pitch for it, talk about where you can get it, go right ahead. Floor is yours.
The Power Fantasy is from Image Comics by me, Castor Wingard, Clayton Cowles, and Ryan Hughes. Clayton letterer, the legendary Ryan Hughes designer. The Power Fantasy is basically based around this kind of, we know the word superpower in our world means, you know, like Superman or whatever. In this world, superpower means nuclear superpower. So there's 6 people with powers equivalent to the nuclear arsenal of the USA. Any of these people, they simply can't fight. Our story is about a story across 50 years of these people trying to not destroy the world by their own idiocy. It's a political drama. It's like, it's a social drama. It's tense as hell. It's like a Cold War thing. It's available in all good comic shops. It's ongoing. I'm going to give people, like, if you're interested, get there quickly. I think we've had to scrap the second cover to reprint it, which means I think there's going to be less copies in the shop than we thought there were going to be. So I think it's going to sell out quickly.
I'll post this early on Wednesday. We'll get it so that people can go and check it out in the afternoon.
Yeah, I say that in a kind of like, you know, I don't know that for sure, but I'm like, if we lose a chunk of the print run, like, because it's, I think this cover of the second one just didn't print properly, so we redid it. So like, I'm aware there's less copies out there than I was thinking. And that's it. It's ongoing. And for anything else particularly, I think it's so funny because I said I compared it to like Die and Wick did earlier in terms of the personalness. I really think it's kind of like an elegance I often have not achieved in my indie work sometimes. Like it's kind of grew from everything I did in Immortal X-Men in realizing these kind of real tight character drama stuff. And Casper is killing it. That's probably the main thing. Like, Casper's an artist who is really good, but as far as I think, this is a leveling up, but also a kind of breakout book. By the time we get to issue 3, he's doing things like, in fact, it's told across 50 years. He's changing his art style across the 50 years.
Ooh, I love when they do that.
Kind of, this whole scene with like, it's 2 of these characters in the 1950s. He's got this wonderful like French soft new wave style, you know, and then there's I don't even want to spoil some of them. Like some of the 60s stuff is some real kind of 60s gritty hippie attack. You've got the 80s stuff and the 90s sort of industrial stuff going on. Like, and he's moving it softly and it's not like it's not the distracting's right. It's not distracting. It's just an artist who's being a poet on the page, and I really couldn't be prouder of him. He's doing astounding work.
Fantastic.
So yep, I'm really excited. I hope people like it because I think it's actually good.
Well,
I'm so British. Like every time I genuinely think this is some of the best things I've ever done, and I can't just say I think this is one of the best things I've ever done. I've got to sort of, be British about it. Anyway, I think it's good.
Well, look, I'm American. I'll say it. I think this is going to be one of the best things you've ever done, personally.
Oh, thank you very much, Matthew.
I know I'm going to be picking it up. I know a lot of people in my community are already going to be picking it up. If you're not, go check it out. Apparently, it's going to be a bit of an exclusive thing, or a bit more limited this week. So go check it out now. I'm really excited for it. I cannot wait to see where it goes. And again, thank you so much, Kieron, for coming on and doing this interview. It was awesome talking to you again.
Thank you. It's been lovely to talk to you, and speak to you soon.
All right, yeah. Talk to you later.